"Be quiet," Edward whispered. But his voice wasn't desire, it was desperation. The crowd froze as his lips met his boss's, and a single gunshot shattered the air. The bullet missed her head by an inch. Cameras flashed, guards screamed, and as smoke curled from the wall behind her, one truth hit everyone like thunder. That kiss just saved her life, or exposed something far deadlier. Welcome to the channel, a place where every story touches the heart and reminds us of life's deepest truths. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and become part of our ever-growing family of dreamers and believers. Before we begin, drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Grab your favorite drink, get comfortable, and let me take you back, 3 years earlier, to the day Edward's life changed forever. Rain poured heavily on the rooftops of downtown. A young man walked aimlessly through the streets, a damp envelope clutched to his chest. His shoes were worn, his shirt soaked, his hope fading. That man was Edward. Once a promising military cadet, he had been trained for greatness, disciplined, determined, and loyal. But all that changed when his mother fell critically ill. He left the academy to care for her, sold everything to pay for her treatment. And when she passed away, Edward was left with nothing, no home, no degree, and no direction. Now, his days were filled with rejection. At every gate he knocked, the answer was the same. "We're sorry, Mr. Edward. You're overqualified. You've got no experience for this role. We'll get back to you." But no one ever did. One evening, as the sun disappeared behind the smoky skyline, Edward returned to his small rented room, only to find his landlord waiting by the door, arms crossed. "3 months without rent," the man barked. "You're useless. Get out of my house." He threw Edward's few belongings, a blanket, some clothes, and a Bible, out into the muddy street. Edward didn't fight back. He just knelt there, in the rain, tears mixing with mud. For a long time, he didn't move. He whispered to himself, "God, if you still see me, please, just one chance." Then, suddenly, his old, cracked phone began to ring. He hesitated, wiping rain from his eyes before answering. "Hello, is this Mr. Edward?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied, voice trembling. "Your application for the Gateman position at Davis Estate has been accepted. You can start immediately." Edward's heart stopped. A Gateman? He looked down at his CV, computer science graduate, former military cadet, and felt a sting of shame. But he also knew this was his only chance to survive. He took a deep breath. "Yes, ma'am. I'll be there tomorrow. Thank you." As the line went dead, Edward stared at the piece of paper showing the address. Davis Mansion, 4 Kingsley Drive. He whispered to himself, "So this is it. The beginning of something new." He didn't know then that the gate he was going to guard would one day become the gate between life and death, and that the woman he would serve would soon owe him her very heartbeat. And that was how Edward's journey began, not with pride, but with desperation. Yet destiny was already writing a story far greater than his pain. Stay tuned, because the day Edward first met Elizabeth Davis, sparks didn't just fly. They collided. The gates of the Davis mansion rose before Edward like the entrance to another world. Black iron bars shimmered beneath the afternoon sun, flanked by marble lion statues that seemed to judge him silently. Beyond them stretched rolling lawns, towering fountains, and gardens trimmed with military precision. For a moment, he just stood there, a worn-out bag slung over his shoulder, his heart pounding like the boots of his old parade ground. Then came the roar of an engine. A sleek black Mercedes glided to a stop at the gate. The door opened, and Elizabeth Davis stepped out. Her presence alone silenced the air. She wore a navy business suit so sharp it could cut glass, her heels clicking on the marble driveway with a rhythm of power. Her hair was pinned up neatly, her diamond earrings catching the sunlight, but it was her eyes, cold, assessing, merciless, that froze Edward in place. "What are you staring at?" she snapped, without even glancing fully at him. "Close the gate." Edward straightened immediately. "Yes, ma'am." His voice was low, disciplined. She pointed toward a small rusted metal shed near the far corner of the property. "That's your quarters. Don't ever come to the main house unless you're called." Then she turned and disappeared inside, leaving the faint scent of her expensive perfume behind, an aroma that clung to authority and loneliness alike. The Gateman's quarters were worse than Edward expected. A leaking roof, cracked walls, a single bed frame with springs poking out like needles. A faint smell of dampness hung in the air, but Edward said nothing. He rolled up his sleeves and got to work, sweeping, scrubbing, fixing what he could. When he was done, he sat on the bed, exhausted, staring at the cracked ceiling. "I've survived worse," he muttered to himself, recalling nights in the military barracks with no food or warmth. "This is temporary. It has to be." From his small window, he could see the mansion's balcony. Every morning, Elizabeth would step out, coffee in hand, eyes fixed on her phone, her expression unreadable. Every evening, she returned in silence, the same unshakable calm masking something deeper. There was loneliness in her stillness, a chill in her beauty, and Edward couldn't help but notice. One afternoon, a group of business associates arrived. Their laughter echoed across the compound as they stepped out of their expensive cars. Edward opened the gate, bowing slightly. One of the men sneered. "Is that your gateman, Elizabeth? He looks like he just crawled out of a slum." Elizabeth didn't even flinch. Instead, she smirked faintly. "He's lucky to have a job at all." The men laughed, and Edward stood there, stoic, silent, his pride burning quietly inside. He saluted politely and turned back to his post. But deep inside, a spark of something fierce was building. He wasn't the kind of man who forgot humiliation easily. That night, as Edward stood guard under the pale glow of the security lights, he heard her voice drifting through an open window. "The defense contract is almost finalized," Elizabeth was saying on the phone. "Once it's signed, Davis Corporation will be untouchable." Her tone was sharp, confident, but there was a note of unease beneath it. Edward's military instincts tingled. Defense contract. Untouchable. Those weren't ordinary business words. He narrowed his eyes toward the mansion, the faint hum of the city in the distance. Something told him this woman, this cold, commanding mistress, was involved in more than business. And deep down, Edward sensed that stepping into this mansion was not the beginning of a job, but the beginning of a war. If you think this is just a story about a rich woman and her gateman, think again. What's about to happen next will make you question loyalty, power, and fate itself. So stay tuned, because what will happen next is where the real storm begins. The night was heavy with silence. The same silence that hid secrets beneath luxury and power. Edward stood by the gate, eyes fixed on the mansion windows, his instincts whispering what his mind didn't want to admit. Danger was coming. Inside the mansion, Elizabeth Davis was in her element. Gone was the cold heiress who snapped at her staff. Now, she was the CEO, a storm of confidence and control. The boardroom glowed with soft amber light. At the head of the long glass table, Elizabeth reviewed a line of documents, while a dozen executives waited nervously. "Cut the supplier in Hong Kong," she said sharply. "We'll handle production in-house. I'm not paying for inefficiency." Her voice was calm, decisive, the kind that silenced rooms and ended arguments. Across from her sat Mark Hensley, her business partner. Smooth, charming, and always perfectly dressed. He laughed easily, spoke softly, and seemed to know what Elizabeth needed before she even asked. "Brilliant move as always, Liz," he said, flashing his trademark grin. "You're 2 steps ahead of everyone." She smiled faintly. "That's why Davis Corporation is still standing." Mark leaned closer. "And it'll stay that way. as long as you have me watching your back." Elizabeth nodded, unaware of the shadow behind his charm. "Mark has been with me from the beginning," she told the board proudly. "He's family." Family. The word hung in the air like a promise. Or a curse. Days later, the defense contract was finalized. A $50 million military technology deal. The biggest in the company's history. The press went wild. Headlines screamed, "Elizabeth Davis seals multi-million-dollar defense deal. Makes history in national security sector." The celebration was grand. Cameras flashed, reporters swarmed, and Elizabeth stood tall before the world. Mark clapped beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "You did it, Liz," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. But later that night, when the lights dimmed and the crowd was gone, Mark sat alone in his car, phone pressed to his ear. "She signed it," he said quietly. "Yes, the full amount. No, she doesn't suspect anything. Proceed with the plan." He ended the call, adjusted his tie, and smiled into the darkness, a smile colder than Elizabeth's marble floors. Back at the gate, Edward noticed things others didn't. Strange cars driving by the mansion at odd hours. Headlights that lingered too long before vanishing into the night. And then there was Mark. He had seen him more than once, standing outside the gate, speaking with men Edward didn't recognize. Men who never entered the house, but always left with quick handshakes and hushed voices. One night, while inspecting the estate's old radio security channel, something the guards rarely used anymore, Edward froze, static, then a voice, low and deliberate. "Target confirmed. Elizabeth Davis. Timeline, 72 hours." Edward's blood ran cold. He knew that tone, that phrasing, that calm precision. It was assassination protocol, the same kind he'd studied back in the military. He sprinted toward the control room, bursting through the door where the head of security sat, scrolling on his phone. "Sir," Edward panted, "I intercepted something." "Someone's targeting Madame Elizabeth. We need to—" The man scoffed without looking up. "Stay in your lane, Gateman. You're not paid to imagine stories." Edward clenched his fists. "This isn't imagination. The channel was active." "I said enough," the man barked. "Go back to your post." The door slammed in his face. Outside, the night air felt colder. Edward stood there, torn between pride and duty. She had mocked him, humiliated him before her guests. She probably wouldn't believe him if he tried to warn her. But as he looked up at her balcony, at the faint light still glowing in her office, his conscience spoke louder than his pride. He whispered to himself, "I made an oath once, to protect life, no matter who it belongs to." He took a deep breath, eyes scanning the shadows around the estate. "If they're coming for her, they'll have to get through me first." And with that, Edward made his silent vow. "I'll watch over her myself," he murmured, gripping the gate handle like a soldier gripping his rifle, "even if she doesn't know it." They say loyalty is tested not by how you're treated, but by what you do when no one's watching. Edward was about to learn that the hard way, because the enemy won't just strike from the shadows, it'll come wearing a familiar face. The night air was heavy, humming with quiet tension. Edward stood at the edge of the driveway, eyes tracing the line of the estate walls. From this distance, Elizabeth's mansion looked peaceful. But Edward knew better. Peace, he had learned long ago, was often the silence before chaos. Since the night he overheard the transmission, he had become a ghost in uniform, guarding from the shadows. After his shifts ended, he no longer went to his small room behind the gatehouse. Instead, he patrolled the grounds in secret, moving silently between hedges and marble statues, eyes sharp, mind alert. He'd once been trained to watch for patterns, and now, those instincts returned like muscle memory. Every night for 3 days, he noticed it. A black van parked 2 blocks down the street, lights off, engine silent. It stayed there for hours, then drove away just before dawn. The next evening, while scanning the perimeter, Edward caught a flicker of movement by the hedge near the east garden. A man, camera in hand, snapping photos of Elizabeth's office windows. By the time Edward reached the spot, the man was gone, leaving behind only the faint crunch of gravel and the smell of cigarette smoke. Edward's gut twisted. The pattern was no coincidence. Someone was studying her, learning her habits, her roots, her vulnerabilities. And she had no idea. Inside the mansion, Elizabeth's world was glowing, literally. Chandeliers sparkled, laughter echoed, and champagne flowed like water. She had hosted a celebration dinner for the defense contract's success. Her friends, investors, and partners filled the room with compliments. Cameras flashed. Waiters moved elegantly between guests carrying trays of golden glasses. At the head of the table stood Mark Hensley, smiling that same practiced smile. He raised his glass high. "To Elizabeth Davis," he said, voice ringing with charm. "The most fearless woman I know. The kind of leader who doesn't just chase success, she defines it." The crowd cheered, glasses clinked. Elizabeth's eyes softened as she raised her own glass. "Thank you, Mark. I couldn't have done it without you." Mark's grin widened, but behind it was something darker, something deadly. Because even as the applause filled the air, the men he hired were already in motion. Later that night, the mansion fell quiet. Elizabeth walked through the garden, reading documents under the pale glow of her tablet. The world beyond her success, the whispers, the threats, the silent war, didn't exist in her mind. Edward approached carefully, removing his cap. "Madam," he began softly, "I need to speak with you. It's urgent. I believe—" Without looking up, she cut him off. "What could you possibly need to tell me? Unless the gate's broken, I don't want to hear it." He stepped closer, heart pounding. "Please, ma'am, your life may be in danger. There are men watching the estate. I've intercepted—" Elizabeth's laughter sliced through the air like glass. "My life?" she said, turning toward him, her eyes filled with disdain. "What would you know about my life, Edward? You're a gateman. Stay out of matters you don't understand." Before he could reply, she turned and walked away, her heels echoing on the marble path, fading into the house and leaving him standing in the dark. For a long moment, he just stood there, jaw tight, fists trembling. He had risked everything to warn her, and she dismissed him like dust on her shoe. But his resolve only hardened. Hours later, as the estate slept, Edward sat alone in the security booth, headphones on, scanning the radio frequencies. Then, static. A faint voice. "Window closes tomorrow. Evening event. Outdoor setting. Confirmed." Edward froze. Tomorrow. The hit was scheduled for tomorrow night. He stared at the glowing red light on the console, his reflection faint in the glass. His mind began racing, mapping escape routes, camera angles, vantage points. He would have to act fast, smarter than the professionals coming for her. Reaching into his drawer, Edward pulled out an old, worn military knife, the only piece of his past he'd never sold or discarded. The blade caught the light, sharp and silent. He whispered, voice steady and low, "Tomorrow, I'll prove my worth, whether she wants me to or not." The camera of fate had started rolling, and this time, Edward wasn't just the gateman. He was the invisible guardian. Elizabeth thought she was untouchable. But as danger draws closer, her only hope might be the man she humiliated. The trap is set, and the night will decide who lives and who doesn't. The dawn came painted in gold, but beneath its glow, danger lurked unseen. The Davis estate was a flurry of motion. Workers trimming hedges, decorators arranging banners, reporters setting up cameras. Today wasn't just any day. It was Elizabeth Davis's grand outdoor business conference, a public show of power, success, and, unknowingly, her death trap. From the gatehouse, Edward watched the preparations unfold with a sinking feeling. His hands tightened around his walkie-talkie. Every instinct screamed, something's wrong. The air itself felt different, heavy, charged. Inside the mansion, Elizabeth stood before her mirror, flawless in a tailored white suit. Her assistant buzzed around her, adjusting the lapel mic. "Madam, the investors are already arriving," she said. Elizabeth smiled faintly, confidence radiating from her. "Good. Let them see the face of progress." Across the estate, Mark Hensley was already there, early, smiling more than usual. His voice was silk, smooth and reassuring, as he directed staff where to place the podium and press tables. No, move the podium 2 feet to the right," Mark insisted. "Yes, perfect. The lighting hits just right here. It'll make Elizabeth shine." And indeed, the spot he'd chosen gave her the perfect glow for photographs, and the perfect line of sight for a sniper stationed in the abandoned building across the street. Edward, standing at his post, saw Mark's positioning, and his stomach twisted. The man was too precise, too calm. He wasn't arranging a press setup, he was arranging a kill zone. For the next hour, Edward battled the war inside his head. He could feel the weight of every decision pressing on him. Should he rush to Elizabeth now? Should he call the police? But what would he even say? "My boss is about to be assassinated because of a voice I heard on a radio." They'd laugh him off, arrest him for trespassing, fire him for insubordination. He clenched his fists, whispering to himself, "No proof, no backup, just instincts." But those instincts had saved lives before. He'd seen this kind of calm before chaos, in the military, just before an ambush. He exhaled sharply. "If I act too early, they'll try again. If I wait too long, she'll be dead." His decision hardened like steel. He'd wait, but stay close. Watch every hand, every movement, every shadow. By mid-morning, sleek cars began rolling through the gates. Reporters adjusted their cameras, while investors in designer suits stepped onto the estate's perfect lawn. The air buzzed with conversation and camera clicks. Edward, in his simple uniform, stood near the driveway, scanning every angle, rooftops, balconies, reflections in glass windows. A group of women in shimmering dresses whispered and laughed as they passed. "Still has that dirty Gateman?" one sneered. "For a millionaire, she has strange taste in help." Edward didn't even look their way. His focus was elsewhere, on a faint metallic glint from the building across the street. It flashed for a split second and disappeared. His breath hitched. "There it is," he muttered under his breath. "They're here." He adjusted his cap and stepped away from the gate, his eyes darting across the estate. Every movement seemed magnified, every sound sharper. On the stage, Elizabeth stepped up to the podium, her smile dazzling for the cameras. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice poised and confident. "Today marks a new era of innovation for Davis Technologies." Mark stood beside her, his hand resting casually on the podium, his face glowing for the press. But behind that smile was a man counting down seconds. Edward moved closer, ignoring the disapproving glares of guests and guards alike. His boots pressed softly on the gravel as he advanced, never taking his eyes off Elizabeth. "Hey, Gateman!" a security officer barked. "Get back to your position." Edward didn't even turn. His pulse thundered in his ears. The moment had come. Then he saw it, a tiny red dot dancing across Elizabeth's blue jacket. His blood ran cold. Target acquired. Every muscle in his body tensed, adrenaline flooding his veins. "No time," he whispered. "I have to move. Now." Edward's next move will change everything. His job, his life, and Elizabeth's fate. Stay tuned for where loyalty meets danger in a heartbeat, and a single decision draws the line between life and death. The world seemed to move in slow motion. The red laser still danced over Elizabeth's chest, bright against her blue suit. Edward's heartbeat thundered in his ears. Boom, boom, boom. Louder than the chatter, louder than the cameras. Every instinct screamed at him to act now. He didn't think. He ran. "Stop that man!" someone yelled. Guards turned, confusion spreading like wildfire. Reporters gasped as Edward bolted past the crowd, weaving through startled investors and photographers. Elizabeth's eyes widened in disbelief as she saw her gateman charging toward her. "What on earth?" she began, her words slicing through the air. Mark, standing beside her, froze. His confident smile faltered, panic flashing briefly in his eyes. He knew. He knew what was about to happen. Edward reached the stage, boots pounding the wooden platform. He grabbed Elizabeth by the shoulders and whispered sharply, breathless, "Be quiet." Then, before she could even flinch, he kissed her. The world erupted. Gasps rippled through the audience. Cameras flashed furiously. Elizabeth's eyes flew open, wide with shock and fury. The great Elizabeth Davis, kissed by her gateman, in front of media, investors, and the world. Security shouted, "Get him off her!" and rushed forward. Then, crack. A single gunshot split the air. The sound echoed like thunder, sharp and final. A chunk of marble exploded just inches behind Elizabeth's head. Dust and debris showered down. The bullet lodged deep into the wall where her skull had been a heartbeat ago. For a fraction of a second, silence. Then chaos. Screams. Panic. People diving for cover. Cameras crashing to the ground. Armed guards swarmed the stage, forming a human shield around Elizabeth. Edward was thrown to the floor, rough hands pressing his face into the ground, guns pointed at him. "Down! Stay down!" someone barked. Elizabeth stood frozen, trembling, eyes darting from the hole in the wall to Edward lying face down before her. Her fingers rose unconsciously to her lips, trembling. The warmth of his desperate kiss still lingered there. Then her gaze shifted to the bullet hole again, and realization struck her like lightning. He saved me." Her voice was barely a whisper, but those close enough heard it. Another crack echoed, then another. The snipers were fleeing. Security shouted orders, returning fire. Edward, pinned to the ground, raised his head just enough to shout, "Northeast rooftop! 2 shooters! Go!" The guards looked up, scanning the skyline before sprinting into formation. From a distance, police sirens wailed, the sound of backup rushing toward the chaos. In the corner of his eye, Edward spotted Mark slipping away through the side gate, jacket half open, eyes darting nervously. "Stop that man!" Edward yelled hoarsely. "He's part of this!" Security hesitated, but Elizabeth turned, voice shaking. "Do as he says!" 2 guards caught Mark just as he reached his car, his calm facade shattered. "Let me go. You don't know what you're doing." Edward staggered to his feet, bruised but defiant. From his pocket, he pulled out his old phone. "I recorded everything," he said, voice steady despite the chaos. "The radio transmissions, the planning calls, it's all here." Mark's face twisted in disbelief and rage. "You're just a gateman. Who's going to believe you?" Edward met his eyes with quiet strength. "I was trained by the military to protect and observe. I know betrayal when I see it." Moments later, police officers flooded the grounds. Mark was handcuffed, still shouting, "You don't deserve that money, Elizabeth. I built this company too." His words faded as they dragged him away. Elizabeth stood still amid the flashing lights, her body trembling. Around her lay shattered glass, fallen decorations, and chaos. But her eyes were fixed on one man. The gateman she'd mocked. The one she'd humiliated. The one she'd refused to listen to. And yet, he had risked his life for hers. Tears welled in her eyes, not from fear, but from shame and gratitude. She whispered, her voice breaking, as she stared at Edward being questioned by police, still humble, still calm. "What have I done?" She finally saw the truth. But was it too late to make it right? Don't go anywhere, because redemption takes center stage. The walls of pride begin to crumble, and the woman who once ruled with iron discovers the power of humility. The flashing lights from police cruisers still painted the Davis estate in streaks of red and blue as the chaos began to settle. The crowd was gone, but the echoes of gunfire and panic still lingered in the air. Inside the grand marble foyer, Edward sat on a chair, flanked by two officers, giving his official statement. His uniform was torn, his face streaked with dust, yet his composure was unwavering. The lead investigator pressed play on Edward's phone, and the room fell silent. She signed it. Yes, the full amount. No, she doesn't suspect anything. Proceed with the plan. Mark's voice filled the air like poison. The officers exchanged looks. That's enough, one said grimly. This confirms it. He's our man. Within hours, word spread across the city. The assassins had been captured at a toll gate trying to flee. Under interrogation, they confessed everything. Mark Hensley had hired them to eliminate Elizabeth in exchange for her $50 million defense contract share. The betrayal ran deep. But the truth was finally out. By morning, the world knew. News vans crowded the gates. Cameras flashed relentlessly. Reporters shouted questions over one another. Edward, how did you know she was in danger? What made you act when no one else did? Did you really kiss her to save her life? Edward stood before the estate gates, calm and polite, his voice soft but steady. I was just doing my duty, he said simply. Anyone in my position would have done the same. But the world didn't see just a Gateman. They saw a hero. Headlines flooded every channel. Gateman hero saves millionaire from assassination. The kiss that saved a life. Courage in uniform. The humble guard who defied death. Within hours, Edward's picture went viral. #Gateman hero trended across social media. People everywhere praised his courage, his humility, and his selflessness. But inside the mansion, Elizabeth Davis wasn't celebrating. She sat alone in her study, surrounded by silence. Her reflection in the glass window looked back at her. The face of a woman who had everything, yet had almost lost it all because of her pride. She replayed every cruel thing she'd ever said to Edward, every insult, every moment she dismissed his warnings. Her words haunted her now. You're a gateman. Stay out of matters you don't understand. And yet, it was that same Gateman who had understood more than anyone. She turned on the television. The screen showed Edward, still in his dusty uniform, answering reporters with quiet dignity. Her eyes filled with tears. What have I done? She whispered again, her voice trembling. Across town, Mark Hensley sat in a cold interrogation room, his once polished image reduced to a broken shell. His assets were frozen, his name tarnished. You don't understand, he ranted. I built that company. She wouldn't be anything without me. The officer didn't flinch. And yet you tried to kill her. At his arraignment, the judge's words cut like a blade. You attempted to murder your business partner for greed. You are a danger to society. Bail denied. The cameras flashed as Mark was led away in handcuffs, his fall from grace complete. Back at the estate, reporters found Edward again, not in the mansion, not celebrating, but back in his small, worn quarters. He was cleaning the little space quietly, just as he did every evening. When a journalist asked why, he smiled faintly. I don't expect any reward, he said. I just couldn't stand by and watch someone die. Those words spread like wildfire. People shared his clip millions of times. The world admired his heart more than his heroics. That night, when the noise had faded and the moonlight washed over the estate, a soft knock came on Edward's door. He opened it to find Elizabeth Davis, standing there in a plain sweater, her eyes swollen from tears. For the first time, she wasn't the untouchable CEO. She was just a woman, humbled, human, and hurting. Edward straightened, unsure of what to say. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "May I come in?" she asked quietly. I need to apologize." And that's where everything changes, because forgiveness can be just as powerful as courage, where pride turns to gratitude, and two unlikely souls begin a story no one saw coming. Edward nodded and stepped aside. She sat on the edge of the simple chair by his desk, her eyes scanning the walls. A few old photographs, military medals neatly arranged, and a framed picture of an elderly woman. Her voice trembled. "Your mother?" Edward nodded. "Yes, ma'am. She raised me alone." Elizabeth exhaled slowly, her heart heavy. "I was wrong about you, Edward. So terribly wrong." She looked around again. The cracked paint, the simple bedding, the humble dignity of it all. "I saw you as beneath me. I treated you like you were invisible." Edward didn't speak, only listened. His silence was respectful, not cold. Tears welled in Elizabeth's eyes. "You risked your life for someone who showed you nothing but contempt. Why?" Edward's reply was calm but powerful. "Because it was the right thing to do, and because I once took an oath to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. That oath didn't end when I took off my uniform." Elizabeth's composure broke. "I never asked about your past. I never cared who you were before this job." She swallowed hard, her voice shaking. "And yet, you could have been anything. You chose integrity over comfort. And She covered her face. "I'm so sorry, Edward. For everything." Edward's gaze softened. "You didn't know. But now you do." For the first time, Elizabeth smiled, not as a CEO, but as a human being seeking redemption. The next morning, the world gathered again, but this time, not for an assassination or business meeting, but for atonement. Elizabeth stood before a sea of cameras, microphones flashing. Her voice, steady but emotional, carried across the estate. "I want to thank Edward, the man I wrongly called just a gateman." She paused, glancing at him standing behind her in a crisp suit. "He is the bravest, most honorable person I've ever known. I was blinded by wealth and pride. I forgot that true worth isn't measured by money or titles." The crowd murmured in awe. She turned toward Edward. "If you'll accept, I want to offer you a new role. Head of Security for Davis Enterprises." Gasps rippled through the audience. Cameras zoomed in on Edward's thoughtful face. Edward stepped forward, looked at her, and said quietly but firmly, "I accept. Not because of the title or the money, but because I believe in second chances. For both of us." The crowd erupted in applause. Weeks later, the Davis estate was transformed. A new culture thrived, one built on respect. Elizabeth implemented policies that valued every worker's voice. Edward, now in his element, introduced advanced security systems and ethical oversight for the defense project. They became a team, one guided by honor and humility. Edward finally moved out of the gatehouse. He rented a small apartment in town and brought his ailing mother to live with him. As she held his hands, tears streaming down her face, she whispered, "My son, the hero." He smiled. "Just a man who did what was right, Mama." A few days later, Elizabeth personally visited Edward's mother. She apologized for everything, not as a boss, but as a changed woman. Soon after, she launched a scholarship fund in Edward's name to support underprivileged youth pursuing careers in security, military service, and technical innovation. As she looked at Edward across the room, her eyes softened. "You didn't just save my life, Edward," she said quietly. "You changed it." And for the first time, both of them smiled. Not as boss and employee, but as two people forever transformed by courage, grace, and redemption. If this story touched your heart, don't scroll away. Like, share, and subscribe to keep more powerful stories like this alive. Because sometimes, one act of courage can rewrite an entire life. 6 months had passed since the day Edward Davis saved a life and changed an empire. The Davis estate no longer felt like the fortress it once was. It breathed with warmth, teamwork, and respect. The walls that once echoed with commands now carried laughter and conversation. Edward, now the head of security, oversaw a team of trained professionals. Each morning, guards stood straighter when he walked by, not out of fear, but admiration. They called him Sir Edward, a title he still struggled to get used to. Elizabeth, too, had changed. She no longer sat behind marble walls and glass towers. She walked the grounds, greeting staff by name, listening, learning. When she and Edward met for briefings, their exchanges were filled with trust and mutual regard. Two people from opposite worlds, now partners in purpose. The courtroom was silent when the verdict was read. 25 years in federal prison. Mark stood motionless, his eyes cold, his expression empty. No apology, no regret. Edward sat quietly in the back row. He wasn't there for revenge, he was there for closure. As guards led Mark away, Edward whispered under his breath. He had everything, yet greed consumed him. Outside, reporters asked, "Do you feel justice was served?" Edward simply replied, "Justice isn't about revenge, it's about learning. I just hope others will." Edward's story swept across the nation like wildfire. News outlets called it the miracle at the gate. Social media overflowed with messages of inspiration. Hashtags trended: Gateman hero, never look down, the Gateman effect. Soon, stories began to surface. Ordinary workers being promoted, unsung heroes being recognized, companies reevaluating how they treated their lowest paid employees. A journalist summed it up best. The Gateman effect reminds us that true value often stands quietly behind the gate. Months later, Edward was invited to speak before thousands of young people at a youth empowerment summit. He stood on stage, wearing a modest suit, speaking with sincerity rather than flair. "I was rejected, homeless, and looked down upon," he said, "but I never gave up on my worth." The crowd listened in silence. Your circumstances don't define you. Your character does. Life may test you, but every test is training for your moment. Stay ready. Your moment will come. The hall erupted in applause. Elizabeth had become an advocate for worker dignity. She launched a foundation supporting families of security personnel and low-income employees. "Edward taught me to see people, not positions," she said in a televised interview. "I built a business, but he helped me build a legacy." Under her new leadership, Davis Enterprises was no longer just a symbol of power. It became a beacon of compassion and fairness. One crisp morning, Edward returned to the same gate where his story began. Only this time, he arrived in a company car. His uniform replaced by a tailored suit. A young gateman straightened as he approached. "Good morning, sir," the boy said nervously. Edward smiled warmly. "Good morning. What's your name?" "James, sir." "Well, James," Edward said with a kind nod, "remember this. Where you start doesn't determine where you'll finish. Stay faithful, stay vigilant." James grinned. "Yes, sir, I will." Edward looked up at the estate, the place that once symbolized his limits, now the symbol of his rise. This is the story of Edward, the gateman who became a hero, a reminder that greatness isn't found in titles or wealth, but in character, courage, and conviction. Never look down on the quiet ones at the gate, in the kitchen, or in the corner, because sometimes the people society ignores are the very ones chosen by fate to protect its powerful. And sometimes, one act of bravery can change not just a life, but the world around it. As the sun set over the Davis estate, Edward and Elizabeth stood side by side on the balcony. The city glowed beneath them. Alive, hopeful, changed. "Thank you," Elizabeth said softly, "for not giving up on me." Edward smiled, eyes on the horizon. "Thank you for learning to see beyond the gate." And that is how the Gateman became a legend. If Edward's story inspired you, don't just watch, share it. Let the world remember, respect everyone, believe in yourself, and never underestimate the quiet ones. Subscribe for more powerful stories that touch the heart and awaken the soul.